Hi everyone and welcome back to English for You. I'm Pat.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're on part 2 of our article about Tokiwa-so, which is an important building if you're a manga fan. Although if you passed it and didn't know what it was, you might just think it looks like any old Japanese building. It's got old walls, it's got a metal roof. I mean, you wouldn't know why it was special.
Absolutely.
But it is.
That's right. And why is it special? Because it's where some important manga artists lived and worked back in the day or back in history. Who? These included Tezuka Osamu, the creator of Astro Boy, the famous little boy with rocket-powered feet, and Fujiko Fujio, the two artists who made Doraemon or Doraemon. So two of the famous artists or artist groups that worked at Tokiwa-so. And of course, there are many, many more.
Now, this building where they all lived and worked was actually knocked down in 1982, the original. However, it has been recreated. They've kept all the details, all the way it looked and how small it was, and all the things that made the original building so special. They've kept all that. They haven't tried to make it new and modern and fancy. They've kept that old look and they reopened it to the public in Tokyo last summer. And best of all, the museum is free to enter. You can just go in and look around. You don't even have to pay. Although I guess there's probably that kind of donation thing where you can put some money in if you want to make sure that the building's kept in a good condition. But
and
anyway,
of course, they will also have an amazing gift shop.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you'll probably spend tens of thousands of yen. So they make up their money by selling you lots of comic book stuff.
Well,
that's why it can be free.
Enough. Yeah, it's fair enough. You know,
For sure.
You want people to go in, but you also want them to pay enough money to keep the museum going.
Absolutely.
Well, today we'll learn about the building's history and about some of the people who worked there and what life was like for them. Let's read through day 2.
Reading.
Tokiwa-so, an important chapter in manga history. All in all, around 11 master manga artists lived in Tokiwa-so during the 1950s and 1960s. Tezuka Osamu became its first famous resident. The following year, Tezuka invited Fujiko Fujio to take over his room. The pair had no money at the time, so Tezuka even gave them his deposit. Before long, Tokiwa-so became home to several struggling artists. Making manga back then was very difficult. There were scarcely any magazines they could work at. If one resident was hired for a drawing job, the others didn't have work. Still, the Tokiwa-so residents were more of a family than rivals. For instance, they would lend each other money for rent and hang out in their rooms together like high school friends. Fujiko Fujio remembered their time at Tokiwa-so fondly. Years later, they wrote about it in Manga Michi, their comic book autobiography. Like the historic house they lived in, the book makes sure that this important piece of manga history will never disappear.
All right, so let's look at today's article where we're going to learn a little bit about the actual history of the original Tokiwa-so manga workshop and why it's so important and so, famous in the world of manga. It says, all in all, around 11 master manga artists lived in Tokiwa-so during the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, this is the back during the time when, comics like Astro Boy and Doraemon were being created, the 1950s and 60s. And it wasn't just the two that we learned about, Tezuka Osamu and Fujiko Fujio, who lived there. 11 master manga artists actually lived and worked there at different times during this period. When you use that phrase all in all, basically to say in total, we could have begun that sentence actually. In total, around 11 master artists lived there. So basically, we're just saying when we add up all the numbers, when we look at the whole history over this 10 or 20-year period. Some came in, some moved out, but if you add them all up, especially the more well-known ones, 11 master manga artists, 11 great creators of the manga comic genre.
Yep, and the first one was a guy who we've already mentioned in day one. The article says Tezuka Osamu, that's the guy who created Astro Boy, became its first famous resident. A resident is a person who lives in a place.
Okay, let's get back to the article. So, Tezuka Osamu was the first well-known one to live there or be a resident. And then the following year, Tezuka invited Fujiko Fujio to take over his room. Oh, interesting. So Tezuka decided to move out, or maybe found himself a bigger room, and he invited Fujiko Fujio to take over his room. Now, we'll learn, actually, that Fujiko Fujio was the name of this manga team. It was actually two people, but they worked under one name of Fujiko Fujio, but they were a manga team. And it says they took over Tezuka's room a year later. When you take something over, that basically means someone hands control of it to you, to another person, all right? If you're taking over your friend's machine, a video game machine, maybe your friend has one, like an old PS3 or PS4, they're getting a new one, and they basically give it to you. They're giving ownership or control of it to you. If a pilot flying an airplane needs to go to the bathroom or something, the co-pilot will take over control of the airplane. You know, they might say something like, I'm handing control to you, or something like that. But basically means it means you're giving power or ownership or control of something to another person. Maybe you sold it to them, maybe you're just lending it to them, but it basically means power is passing or control is passing from one person or one group to another.
Okay, and what we also learn is that Tezuka didn't just invite these two artists to take over his room, he gave them a helping hand. We see in the article that the pair had no money at the time, so Tezuka even gave them his deposit.
How nice.
Yeah, the word deposit means some kind of payment, usually that's made into a bank account rather than straight up by cash. And when we use it to talk about a house or a car, it's the money that you pay at the start in order to rent or use that thing. And the idea is you should get it back at the end of your period of using it or renting it. So if you move into a new house in Taipei, you generally have to give the landlord a deposit of 2 months' rent. And then when you leave again, the landlord will say, okay, maybe this thing needs to be cleaned, maybe this thing needs to be replaced because it's a bit damaged or it's gotten old. So I'll take some of that deposit money and use that for repairs or cleaning, but you can have the rest back. The same will be true if you rented a car or something. You would put some money down first, that's the deposit, and you get it back later on. So here's an example sentence we can use for the same meaning of deposit as in our article. A week before he moved into his new apartment, John gave his landlord 2 months' rent as a deposit. So, yeah, that was very nice of him. So he
Absolutely.
said, yeah, you two guys, you need a home, you need a place to work. Let me help you out and pay the money so that you can take over the room.
There you go. And before long, Tokiwaso became home to several struggling artists. Okay, well, yes, if you're an artist, especially at the beginning of your career and you haven't yet created a great work, something that makes you a lot of money, you could be described as a struggling artist, right? When we talk about struggling is kind of like fighting. If you're fighting with someone, if you're wrestling with them, you're grappling with them, you might be struggling with them. Here we're not talking about fighting in a physical sense, like wrestling or fighting like that. We're talking about they were having problems with money. If you're struggling in your life, it means things are difficult, especially in terms of money, right? When you get out of college and you don't have a job yet and you have to move out and find your own home, You might be struggling for a little while, finding it hard to make enough money to support yourself. But of course, as you work harder and save your money and things like that, you will stop struggling and you'll start to do quite well. And if you're an artist and you create a popular comic like Doraemon, you definitely won't be struggling for very long. You'll be rich pretty soon. But certainly at the very beginning, when they were working on their art and trying to get someone interested in making their art into a manga, into a real comic book, they might have been having some trouble with money. Also in the sentence, before long, this building became home to several struggling artists. So young comic book writers, basically out of art school or something like that, a lot of them began to hear about this place as a place to go. They could share the bills and share ideas with other artists. So soon, or before long, it kind of became like a little comic book factory, almost, as you could say, in the same way that a lot of struggling software designers might go to Silicon Valley and might rent a home together and try to work on the next great program or app or software or something like that. And many of them will share a living space, share the bills, and also work together to come up with a great new idea, or in this case, a great new comic.
That's right. And if we think about the word struggling, here's an example sentence we can use. The government is making a plan to help struggling farmers make it through this difficult time. And I guess like these struggling artists in Tokiwaso, why were they struggling? What was the difficulty of being an artist at that time?
Well, that's a good question. And it wasn't like today, where, of course, manga and manga characters are everywhere. There's comic books, cartoons, T-shirts. People have, lunch boxes or backpacks with manga characters. Well, it says making manga back then, in the 1950s and 1960s, was very difficult.
Yeah, the article gives a bit more detail and says there were scarcely any magazines they could work at. Scarcely means the same as barely. If something is scarce, to use the adjective form, scarcely is the adverb form. If something is scarce, there are not very many. There are very few of these kind of things. We talk about rare animals and say they are scarce, or we could say there are scarcely any tigers left in the wild, or scarcely any giant pandas left in the wild. There are very few of them. So there were 1 or 2 magazines at this time that gave work to comic book manga artists, but only 1 or 2, so it was really hard to get a job there or sell your story to them. Here's another example sentence for scarcely. There were scarcely any seats on the subway during rush hour. So that means there were maybe 1 or 2, but most of the time you just had to stand.
And without many comic books, magazines out there, if anyone got a job, well, the other ones probably didn't get that job. As it says, if one resident was hired for a drawing job, the others didn't have work. They were all trying to get the same job, the same very few jobs that there were out there at the time.
Now, you can imagine this, you would have guessed this might make them very competitive. They're all trying their hardest to get that job, and they get a bit angry and jealous if one gets it, but none of the others do.
Like basketball players all wanting to join the same NBA team or something like that.
Exactly. But in fact, this wasn't the case. We see in the article, it says, still, the Tokiwaso residents were more of a family than rivals. Oh. Now, here the word still is being used in the same way as however. It's presenting a contrast. And the article also contains the grammar point more A than B, or more of A than B. And we use this statement to say something is one thing and not another. It's mostly this thing, not the other thing. Maybe not 100%, but mostly. And we're using this statement to say that despite what you might think or guess at first, something really isn't this, it's closer to something else. So imagine you have 2 friends. They're really close friends. They share everything. You might say to them, they're more brothers than friends. They're so close they might as well be brothers. Or you could imagine a restaurant with lots of things with kids to play with. You could say it's more of a play center than a restaurant. So if you think of another example here, we have the movie had ghosts and monsters, but it was more of a comedy than a horror film. So they were all the kind of stuff you see in a horror film, but actually it was just kind of funny and silly rather than scary. So these guys weren't rivals, they were more like a family of people, a group trying hard to help each other and work together.
Well, that's good because it's nicer to have family around you than rivals, because rivals are the people that you're competing against, the people that you're playing against. Of course, in a sports kind of way, yeah, if you're in a boxing match or a tennis match, the person you're playing against is your rival. If it's not a sport, if you're playing video games or even chess or something like that against another person, that's your rival. We can talk about rival teams as well. The two teams in a game are rivals. They're both competing in the same event, and one of them will win, but they both, of course, want to win. But in another way, in a non-sports or non-competition kind of way like that, anyone you're kind of up against, anyone who could get the thing or could win, and you could end up losing, or you could win, but you're all playing together for the same prize, you're rivals.
Yeah, we see in our next sentence that, for instance, they, that's this group of artists, would lend each other money for rent and hang out in their rooms together like high school friends. So yeah, that's pretty much like that. If somebody gets the job, then he goes, all right, I'll pay rent this month and you pay me back when you get the job and I don't. Because rent is money paid for the use of something that doesn't belong to you. And you pay to use it for a particular amount of time. Rent is often monthly, like when you're renting an apartment. You pay a certain amount of money each month. You could have weekly rent or maybe even an annual rent if you have that kind of agreement, but monthly is probably the more common use. How much you pay for a month of, it could be owning a car, it could be borrowing or even paying for the amount of internet you use, could be a monthly rent to rent that internet connection for a bit. But yeah, cars, houses, modes of transport, those are the common things you would rent because you maybe don't have the money to own one, but you can afford to pay a smaller amount of money each month to use it. So here's an example. Monty has a car. So every month he has to pay extra rent for a parking space. It doesn't belong to him, but for maybe 100 NT a month, he can use that space as if it were his own.
That's very good. He needs somewhere to park his car. And we also talked about this phrasal verb, to hang out. To hang out means to spend casual, free time with another person that you like, that you're friends with, that you want to, spend some time with, doing whatever, watching TV, going to a movie, just sitting around in your apartment or in the park or whatever. You don't have a planned activity. This isn't part of your business or your school activities or something like that. You're doing it in your free time. You're just hanging out.
Yeah, and it was a good time, and we see that Fujiko remembered their time at Tokiwaso fondly. Fondly means to do something with happy or pleasant or warm emotions. It's not a bad time, it's a good time. So when you think of that thing or when you act towards that thing, you do so with a certain amount of warmth and joy and happiness. For example, Trudy looks back on her years in high school fondly. She remembers them as being good times where she was happy, carefree, and all the rest.
All right. And in fact, Fujiko, this team, they enjoyed their time at Tokiwaso so much that later on it actually inspired a manga that they wrote. It says years later they wrote about it. That is, their time at Tokiwaso. Years later they wrote about it in Manga Michi, their comic book autobiography. So they thought it was such a nice story. They kind of wanted to, remember it, not just in photographs or by talking to their friends about, oh, remember when we were young and life was simple. No, they wanted to kind of share the story with other people and also, get it down on paper in a book as like a little bit of history. And that's what people will often do when they write their life story. They're writing their autobiography. A biography is someone's life story. If I wrote a book about a very famous person, their life and the things that they did, kind of the history of who they were and what they did when they were alive, that would be a biography. If I wrote that book about myself, then it would be an autobiography. Now, of course, if I wrote it, no one would care and it wouldn't be a popular book because I'm not famous. But if you are a famous person and you write your own life story, then people might care and they'll buy it. I think Barack Obama just came out with an autobiography about his time being president of America. It wasn't written by another person. It was written by Barack Obama himself. So that's why we call it an autobiography, a life story of a person written by that person themselves. For example, music fans were waiting to buy the popular singer's new autobiography. I wonder if has Madonna written her autobiography?
A lot of people write several these days, covering
absolutely.
different parts of their lives.
I think that would be a popular book with the fans and other people.
So, and we conclude the article by saying, like the historic house they lived in, the book, so that's this Manga Michi autobiography, makes sure that this important piece of manga history will never disappear.
Cool.
So, the new building and this book keep alive that idea of a bunch of struggling artists working together and coming up with some great stuff. That's the end of our article, so we've got a bit of time left for our For You Chat question.
For You Chat.
So the question is, would you like to be a manga artist one day? And what do you think it takes to be successful in this field? I guess we can concentrate on the second part of that question. I think the chances of us becoming artists at this stage of our lives is remote.
Yeah, that's kind of like asking if I want to be an NBA star one day. Well, first of all, I'd have to be really tall and good at basketball, and I'm not.
And a lot younger.
And a lot younger, and I'm not a very good artist. I can't draw anything more complicated than a stick figure. So, yeah, sure, if I could draw really well, it sounds interesting. What do I think it takes to be successful? Well, what it takes to be successful as an artist. Practice, practice, practice. If you want to do an art, whether it's writing or playing music, acting, dancing, being a manga artist, you have to start young and keep working your way at it. If you don't start young, you have to work a little bit harder, I'd say, but many people have talent, they have interest, and they put in a lot of good hard time and practice, and then they become really good.
Yeah, I think a manga artist also needs to be able to write the stories. If I understand the style right, in manga, the artist both draws and tells the story, whereas in a comic book, one guy writes the story, another guy does the pictures, so they divide it up. But so you've got to be a good storyteller to be a manga artist.
And I guess you'd have to read a lot of them too, you know, to get different ideas and to sort of have artists and ideas that inspire you.
Yeah, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening. For English for You, I'm Pat.
And I'm Mike.
We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Tokiwa an important chapter in manga history. All in all, around 11 master manga artists lived in Tokiwa during the 1950s and 1960s. Tezuka Osamu became its first famous resident. The following year, Tezuka invited Fujiko Fujio to take over his room. The pair had no money at the time, so Tezuka even gave them his deposit. Before long, Tokiwa became home to several struggling artists. Making manga back then was very difficult. There were scarcely any magazines they could work at. If one resident was hired for a drawing job, the others didn't have work. Still, the Tokiwa residents were more of a family than rivals. For instance, they would lend each other money for rent and hang out in their rooms together like high school friends. Fujiko Fujio remembered their time at Tokiwa fondly. Years later, they wrote about it in Manga Michi, their comic book autobiography. Like the historic house they lived in, the book makes sure that this important piece of manga history will never disappear.
Vocabulary Review. Deposit. When Daniel moved out of his apartment, the owner gave back his entire deposit of 10,000 NT dollars. Struggling. Hollywood is full of struggling actors who work hard but never get famous. Scarcely. There are scarcely any people in the night market if you go there at 3 p.m. Rent. The owner of Jenny's apartment told her she must pay the rent on the first day of every month. Fondly. Tessa misses her grandfather since he died, and she talks about him fondly. Autobiography. The famous actress wrote an autobiography to tell her fans some interesting stories about her life.
智慧小補帖
Resident. Rival.
以上節目是由活用空中美語製作。活用空中美語雜誌，請洽詢全國各大書店。如欲索取視聽教材，請來電02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上網查詢，網址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net